Hello, Global Theater. My name is Jerry Fielka. Today is Feb 21, 2023. We want to thank Rob Grant and his amazing podcast, I'm Probably Wrong About Everything. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here at our Laughtears Salon with the great Roy Benjamin. It's called the Roy Benjamin Salon. Number 27. How cool is that? It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with people I learn a lot from, and I'm grateful to Decio, Tim, Peter R, Peter Q, and Duncan. We might have a few other guests joining us. And gentlemen, the first round robin question is this book that we're celebrating that Roy just put out called Beat the Bounds, Excess and Restraint, and Joyce's later work. Roy Benjamin, there's the illustration he had to pay big bucks for. Talks about boundaries in place. I loved it that he included Camille Paglia, Ken Wilber, Zizek, and of course Marshall McLuhan, especially because Roy got knee deep in the swamp muck of the Gutenberg galaxy. This is very rare in Joyce studies. McLuhan's chalked off as a charlatan. Peter Q put him in his great pantheon list, way up there at the top. Thank you, Peter. But you know, most McLuhanites, there's a big slew of people in McLuhan and academia. They don't even get Joyce, and they don't even know that Marshall indeed said, in order to get me, in order to understand me, you have to know everything about James Joyce and the symbolists. This is a heavy statement. These people don't want to, Neil Postman out, whatever you want. Any McLuhan person, they don't get Joyce. There's a few of them. And it was really a refreshing enlightenment, Roy, for you to include McLuhan in your book. And that's before we met. You were into McLuhan before we met, because I sort of sledgehammer it into people's heads. So you got on page 18, Ken Wilber claimed that a boundary marks off nothing but an inside and an outside. So this is a funny little paradox, that is actually resonating in McLuhan, because he says the words museum without walls. He says center without margins. He doesn't originate those terms. He talks about it. And then he wrote a book called City as Classroom. So the first round robin question is, so we can get everybody involved, is when did you find Joyce to have an impact on you? It's not like, I'm going to start off and give you an example. I was in college at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. I can look on back one of my notebooks, and one of my teachers required me to read Portrait of an Artist. I don't remember anything about it. I'm a idiot. I was raised in front of a TV screen. I don't know how to read anything but magazines. Look at the pictures. So I didn't know anything about Joyce and his impact in literature until about 1984. So I was born in 53. So I meet the great Bob Dobbs prophesizing the connection between McLuhan and Joyce, but more specifically the Wake. And he goes to New York and starts attending that Joyce meeting. What's that guy's name where he had him at his house, Roy? Maybe Peter was there. Murray?
Yeah, Murray.
Yeah.
Yeah. You were there.
Murray Gross.
Murray Gross. So
Murray
Bob
Gross.
started attending those, and I says, well, I can do that. In order for me to understand the wake, the Venice Public Library was opening up a branch in 1990, early 90, and we started a Finnegan's Wake Reading Club, which is over 25 years old now. And so that's when I got the impact. And so the question is when did you get the impact? You know, tell us a brief history. And where was it? So mine was in Venice, California, in a library as a reading group, reading Finnegan's Wake out loud. So Roy, we'll start with you. You know, what's your history with Joyce and the place where you kicked over to it's making an impact, you know?
Yeah. Well, I still remember it was, a friend of mine when I was in high school. I was either junior or senior, and I remember my friend discovered Joyce, and uh, it seemed to have such a profound effect on him. And I wasn't really that big a reader, but I remember looking at Ulysses and thinking I could never forget it, man. I can't understand this. And I actually remember waking up in the middle of the night and thinking, if I really slow down, uh, I could have a chance of uh, of understanding this. And so, so Joyce completely ruined my pleasure in reading forever. I read too slowly
But I mean, when did you kick
to
over to be a
enjoy it.
Joycey? And then, because you've written 18 articles or 17 articles before the book, when did you kick over to be a Joycean, like, or to have it an impact, you know?
Well, I got my PhD in Joyce. I started with my PhD advisor was Edmund Epstein, who wrote The Ordeal of Stephen Dedalus, and grad center. That's actually where I met Phil Mirabelli, who might find this.
Yeah, Phil's too. Yeah.
But yeah, but yeah, it was. I mean, I didn't get anything published until after that experience. But that I think that uh, Epstein really helped to lay the foundations of understanding the wake for me.
And where is that? What's the place? Epstein is turning you into a Wakean.
It's the CUNY Grad Center, the CUNY Graduate Center. That's where I took courses with him and yeah, got my PhD actually on Charles Peirce and Joyce.
But what I'm looking for more here is, does the place have an impact matters? Could you have done that anywhere? And what was that Joycean moment where you kicked over and says, this is the guy I want to study? This is one of my main.
Well, I was yeah, I mean, I was obsessed with him before I went to grad school.
From what book? What book are you
You
getting
know,
obsessed with?
I think the book that obsessed me originally was Ulysses. Yeah, no, uh, yeah, I didn't care that much for a portrait at first. I've come to like it more, but yeah, it was. I remember reading uh, the seventh chapter where you have the headlines
Yeah,
in the Aeolus episode of Ulysses, and I remember it affecting my dreams. Like my dreams started having headlines.
there you go.
Weird.
Gentlemen, that's what I'm looking for. Something where it has an impact on you, and does the place where it did that matter? Okay, Peter Q, you're up. Thank you, Roy.
Okay. So I think I started reading Joyce in like 2007. I was reading Portrait of the Artist. And I was certainly really drawn in. And same with Ulysses. I read Ulysses maybe 2009, and I got really drawn in. But it was always Finnegan's Wake that was the most intriguing to me. Um, and then actually, when I went to the Venice uh, reading group back in like 2009, 2010, and just kind of seeing the way seeing the kind of interpretations that people were coming up with, and seeing how much you could extract from 1 or 2 pages of the text. And then there was a guy there who was like keeping notes of contemporary references on those pages. Like he was talking, he found references to the Super Bowl because it was like Super Bowl Sunday or whatever. And he found the teams that were in the Super Bowl, and he found all these references to like Bush and Cheney and oil wars and all that kind of shit. So I had never encountered that kind of creative interpretation of any piece of art. So that's really what made the big impact on me. And then eventually I moved to Austin, Texas, and I started my own Finnegan's Wake group, kind of inspired by the Venice one. And yeah, ever since then, lots of fun.
That was good, Peter. Keep it brief like Peter. And Peter, just talk about Austin for a few minutes. It has that place. Could you have done that in Long Island? Does it matter to you that it was Austin that you really flourished as a Joycean, let's say?
I guess, yeah, Austin has special qualities in that, there's all kinds of people here, and including really creative and open-minded and interesting people. So our group has always attracted a broad array of people, all different ages, all different backgrounds. And so, yeah, the group is just so much fun. It's been this way for 10 years now.
Super cute. Peter R., you're up. And Richard, you'll get a hint. We're going round robin for people to say, where was the tipping point impact that you became sort of a Joycean, and why was that, and where was it, and was the place part of that? Go ahead, Peter R.
Well, mine goes back to 1966. I was in the Navy in Little Creek, Virginia, and I bought a copy of Ulysses at the PX. And what intrigued me was that it was a story about a Jew living in Dublin, Ireland. I started to read it, gave up. It sat on the shelf for about 20 years. And then after that, I picked it up and delved into it and enjoyed it. Wanted to follow up with Finnegan's Wake, started it. Couldn't make any headway. It was about the year 2000. I found the Finnegan's Wake group of New York, and I contacted them and joined up, and I've been attending ever since.
That's pretty dang good. That's a couple decades. Now, did the place have anything to do? Little Creek, Virginia, or New York?
No, Little Creek just was happenstance. That's where I was stationed.
But New York plays a role because it was pre-Zoom and you were going live. So
yes. We used to attend meetings at the Gotham Book Mart until they closed. And then we sort of drifted around various apartments, as I mentioned, Murray Gross. And I think before Murray, Nick Farignoli headed the Finnegan's Wake Society.
Yeah. Good. Super cool, Peter. Thank you. Decio, you're calling in from Brazil. Tell us your story. I know you buy your sailing equipment right here next to me in Marina del Rey. So,
well, in 1992, I had a friend that was reading Ulysses, and he said it was a parody to the Odyssey. As I was interested in navigation and so on, I became interested in Ulysses. In 1997, I started reading in a translation in Portuguese, but it was a bad translation. The teacher that had translated, he was philology, and he translated, but he didn't read the book, so it was a bad translation. And then later on, we started a group with another teacher that did the translation, a new translation. And so in this group, I became interested. But it was difficult for me to see the parallel between the Odyssey and the Ulysses. And so I started doing lots of research on this. And so I was found, as I read many things about navigation in my life, I started to try to find these points in Ulysses. So after many years, I did my book about Ulysses, navigation is all about. So I'm keep reading and keep reading because Ulysses is a book for your whole life. And about Finnegan's Wake, I started in 2005 and keep going. And still learning a lot, but with so many difficulties.
Well, we always love your input, Decio, but you didn't mention place. Does it matter at all whether you were in Brazil or you could have been in Poland? What does the place have to do with you and Joyce?
My life is one life before Joyce, another life after Joyce.
But it's always been Brazil based.
Yes, Brazil based. Yes. We have groups of reading. We had a group of reading Shakespeare, and then a group in Joyce. I used to read Shakespeare in order to understand Joyce because Shakespeare was in the Navy before starting to be a playwright. So there is lots of nautical terms in his canon. In all the plays, there is mention to the sea, to the rigging, to the parts of the ship, of navigation, metaphorically or physically.
Literally, that's it. Okay, we're going to have Duncan, then Tim, and then Richard, and then Phil. So glad to have you here, Phil. You'll get a hint what we're after. Go ahead, Duncan.
Well, I mean, so far I'm the newbie in the group. I actually, through Sherry Tatum, who I met through a longtime friend who I used to work in a head shop in Austin, Texas, back in the early 70s. Anyway, I met Sherry Tatum. She was nice and chirpy and interesting, said that she was involved in two groups, a Jung group and a Finnegan's Wake group. I said, oh, that sounds like an interesting combination. Why don't you give me some way to contact you, and I'll follow up and ask you to tell me when the next meeting is. Well, and I was interested in Joyce. I had tried Ulysses on my own for who knows how many times. The most recent time had actually been in 2014, and I got about 150 pages in. Anyway, make a long story short, I went to the Austin, Texas Finnegan's Wake meeting, headed by our own Peter Quadrino, and it was at 16th floor of the Irish consulate or something like that. Anyway, it was way up in the air. And there was a nice group of people, and it was like all kinds of things were being said about the page we were reading. I had no idea what the hell was going on. But I like mystery. I like interesting people with interesting interpretations. So I kept on plugging along. And is it the place? Well, you know, the Irish consulate is pretty good to be up on the towering with the sky and looking all over the town. But I think more important was the group of people. You know, it just seemed like when they were.
Hold on, Decio. If you guys want to say something, raise your hand and let me call on you. Don't cut in. Let him finish, and then we'll go to you, Decio. Go ahead, Duncan. Finish up.
And anyway, the Austin Finnegan's Wake meeting and the people there. And then when COVID struck, one of the members of the Austin group who had gone to teach in Taiwan mentioned, hey, you should check out the Sweeney's reading group in Dublin. And so I did. That was fun. And then Jerry Fialka turned up in the Austin Finnegan's Wake thing. And then I started doing things with Jerry and off to the races.
Okay, listen. Again, raising your hand is really good. Thank you, Duncan. What happened with Duncan is he got the idea. He told us how it shaped his behavior. So this is what Roy said. It said it affected his dreams. He likes mystery. So this is what we're after, is sort of like how this thing affected your life to pursue it further. Tim, you're up.
My memories are so confused. I do have three memories of how I got into Joyce. I don't know. There's so many things that have affected me so much more. I don't know how I could say how it affected me. But I have this memory of the radio and being at the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference in 1990 and Genesis of the Music, and who's playing Zappa and interviewing Bob Dobbs. And then there's finding the notice on the Venice Library that there was a Finnegan's Wake reading group. And I actually lived in Marina Del Rey at the time, but I didn't join the group until I moved 40 miles away. And what's the other? I guess those are did I mention three? Oh, yeah, I read Portrait. I don't know when I read it, but that was the first thing. And it really, from Baby Tuco to Stephen's theory of art, the kinetic, and I forget what the other was. That still is the most salient part of this to me. I can understand it. The rest of it, the Finnegan's Wake, is fun because it's like a puzzle. It's like you try to figure it out. But Portrait is understandable, and including that fire and brimstone speech from the Catholic priest.
Thank you, Tim. You answered it fine. And then we got Richard, and then we've got Phil, and then we got Kevin. So, Decio, you wanted to add something. I'm sorry, I cut you off there.
Sorry, you asked me the question if my experience outside of Brazil. I've been in 7 symposia many times. In the symposia, I learned a lot about Joyce, the presentations. I've been in some of them with Peter Quadrino also.
Right.
So we learn a lot in the symposia.
Yeah.
The next one is in Madrid, I think. Is anybody going to Madrid?
We'll see. Peter, you going? Well, listen, this is the question for the last 3 gentlemen on this first round robin question. It's the place where you had that epiphany to kick over to be a Joycean. What's the Joyce you're reading? And then what does the place that it happens at have anything to do with it? Okay, Richard, you're up.
In 1963, when I was in junior high school, I guess, or maybe the first year of high school, we were assigned Araby. And after we read the story, the teacher asked, "Why does the boy of Araby not have a name?" And the answer she provided was, "Well, the girl of Araby doesn't have a first name either." And that just intrigued me. And I sort of, from that point forward, wanted to know what the name of the boy was and what the name of the girl was. And I've been pursuing that for about 50 years in different ways and forms. But beyond that, I then read Portrait, and I immediately identified with the Stephen Dedalus character because I too had very poor eyesight. I couldn't play sports, so I had to be at home. And I read a lot of Joyce at that point. And then finally, by the time I got to college, I had been reading Ulysses. And when I went to, I guess this is all in New York, I had an ad to hire a grant writer to work for the college that I worked at. And my eventual wife, answered the ad. She walked into the room, and the first thing she said to me is, "Oh, you're the Joyce scholar." So she had done her research and seen that I had published on Joyce. And subsequent to that, unlike the rest of us, she's not possessed by Finnegan's Wake. However, she did read the complete Finnegan's Wake, taking the train in to work over a period of 6 months. So I've had a partner to discuss Joyce for the last 20 years that we've been married.
Pretty dang good, Richard. But the thing is that she didn't read Finnegan's Wake out loud with a group of people.
She didn't read it out loud because she was on a train. But when she came home, she would read it to me out loud.
Oh, so she did experience that. Yeah, that's good.
Absolutely.
But one thing is, how's it shaped your behavior? What's it done to you?
I spend too much of my time reading and thinking and writing about Joyce. That's how it shaped my behavior.
It's great to have you here, Richard. Thank you. Okay, Phil, you're up.
Hi, I'm well, first of all, you have a couple of questions. I have a question. I have an answer, but not a question. But anyway, to your question about how I got into Joyce, I'm a Catholic, an ex-Catholic, let me put it that way. And when Joyce kneels down and does not convert at his mother's deathbed, that won me over. I had a psychomachia in my head for many years. Always loved Joyce. Met Chip in graduate school when we were going for a PhD, and but I teach a couple of stories from Joyce now. I have a course that I just made that I teach. I'm a gender studies person and Shakespearean more, but I'm I'm really fascinated by the relationship people are mentioning between those two, and Chip is who I know. But I want to just jump right to this question that I have mostly for Chip and for everybody.
Well,
else.
wait, Phil. Let's finish the round robin. We're going to go to the questions for,
Okay.
and some people don't know that Roy's other name is Chip.
Right.
So just keep that in mind. That's all right.
I don't know.
But
if
Phil,
Phil,
it's all right. And all we ask for the people who came in late is, if you want to say something, raise your hand and I'll call on you. Then we don't have this crossover. And indeed, Phil, you'll be up first for the questions when we go to Roy or
okay,
Chip.
That's
good. It's good to have you here. But there's one thing you didn't answer, Phil, is did place have a role in your Joycean explorations? Did it matter whether you were there or here or any place?
Well, I'm a New Yorker, and to me, I don't know. To me, and as I said, Catholic, ex-Catholic from New York. I don't know. But to me, it's like, I don't know. That's a great question. I have to, but I think it has a lot. There's a resonance between this metropolis type of multicultural New York and this explosive consciousness of Joyce that I think is really related somehow. So in that sense, place because I was in the explosion of certain circles of New York, and by the way, I taught Ulysses once to a graduate school, and the second time it was the second or third time I read it, it was like I always had this feeling, this line from Dylan about your consciousness explodes when you read Ulysses. Yeah. It just kind of is all over the, so it's like cyberspace. It's like, I don't know, it's place, no place, but it's being
perfect, Phil. That's perfect. You nailed it, because first of all, you said that's a great question. And John Cage, who became a Joycean because of McLuhan, said, when they asked him a question, he said, "That's a really good question. I wouldn't want to ruin it with an answer." And the other thing you evoked about New York, because you actually answered the question really well using this metaphor of explosion, was my friend Bleecker Bob. You guys might have bought your records at his store in New York City. He would say, "I'm not an asshole. I'm from New York." And I would say that's applicable to Joyce too. Okay, Kevin, you're up. Do you get the question, or you need me to repeat it?
I think I probably need you to repeat it since I'm coming.
Tell us where you kicked over to be a Joycean or to really get Joyce, and did place play a role in that?
I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer that. I don't really think of myself as a Joycean because it's kind of
Okay, let's just say
academic connotations.
yeah,
But
yeah.
in
Okay,
terms
let's
of
drop
terms
that
of
word.
place,
Yeah.
definitely. I'm a
Try-
Dubliner, basically.
Okay.
And I read Joyce initially.
Hello?
Dublin in the 50s and early 60s was a pretty boring place. So I read a lot of books, and I read a lot of books about Dublin. And Joyce is a great storyteller amidst everything else. I think that tends to actually get forgotten. So for me, yeah, it was fascinating actually reading books like Portrait and Dubliners, actually, passing by the places and the people at the same time. I could really relate to it. In terms of Finnegan's Wake, then, actually, again, I mean, I did not actually start reading it in Dublin. I'm a development worker, which means I spend a lot of time sometimes in boring situations waiting for things to happen and planes to arrive. And I bought it as the ideal book to actually just read almost mindlessly. But yeah, I've become kind of fascinated by it. In terms of how it actually ties into me and my interests, I find it, I find the Wake Watchers group fascinating because there is so many different perspectives come at me. And even just listening to the same piece read in different accents actually, opens up a whole box of possibilities that I actually love. And for me, just now, I mean, my major interest is in actually Finnegan's Wake take on Irish history and culture. And it kind of ties in with that interest that I've always had. I've always been kind of a nerd, actually, about history, etc. So that's, I guess, where it would kick in for me. But I'm not sure I ever had a massive epiphany while reading
all right.
Joyce. Who knows?
Again,
maybe tonight, Jerry. Who knows?
Well, again, like T.S. Eliot said, when I talk to you, I've got to use words. And of course, since Joyce invented this Zoom format and disguised it as a book, we should be doing this with no spoken word only and just gesture and holding our notes to the camera. But Phil's going to start our next round robin. Thank you so much. If anyone, again, has any comments on the comments we've heard so far, that was amazing. Everybody did great. Phil, we're going to open it up now.
Okay.
Round robin questions for Chip Roy. You're up, Phil.
All right. As I was saying, I do gender. I have a gender agenda, I guess. But I was reading, so I read the chapter on gender, and fascinating. But I was trying to get. I guess maybe I would try to get the thrust maybe more than I should, rather than floating in the associative world. But to me, maleness is very different than femaleness. So when you talk about crossing gender boundaries, it's very different if you're a man than if you're a woman. And I wanted Chip to talk about that because I love the freedom and the idea of like this. I mean, this progressiveness about trying to overcome that, but yet we're stuck in a historical cultural system that has constructed maleness very differently than it constructs masculinity. Is so much associated with power that I was reading a couple of trans things, which is not really. I think I'm kind of to me was going. I think crossing boundaries is interesting in that too. But anyway, so it's like how you see all these crossing boundaries that Chip was delineating, and not only in Finnegan's Wake, but all over the wonderful corpus of Joyce's work. But I got a sense that it was like, where is the historical power issues in terms of crossing boundaries? Because crossing, like masculinity is the same as femininity in our culture, in our history, in most cultures. I want Chip to talk a little bit about the crossing of boundaries in terms of the embeddedness and the totally very different connotations and of masculinity versus femininity. So if you cross from one to the other, because there's a wonderful freedom of that, but I worry about that because it seems to ignore the power, the power aspects of masculinity and femininity.
Good question, Phil. Go for it, Roy.
Okay, well, where do I begin with that? I mean, I think in there's Bloom is condemned for being a half and half. That he's partially male, partially female, but this he is condemned by the hyper masculine citizen who was the nationalist, the bully. But I associate that with Stephen's Shakespearean theory in the library, where his I mean, it's kind of a screwy theory that Shakespeare was actually emasculated by Anne Hathaway. The fact that she seduced him when he was young. She was 26 and he was 18. What the age difference was, but he does. He mythologizes that. He associates that with the Venus and Adonis, the poem. He thinks of that as Shakespeare retelling the experience of being seduced by the goddess, Venus and Hathaway. But the Adonis myth, the Attis myth, they're in Fraser. They involve castration, changing over into the other sex. And I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. I mean, you're more interested in the idea of power inequalities.
Well, Venus has the power. And Joyce's idea is that Anne Hathaway, being 8 years older, had the power, and so therefore you get an interesting gender reversal which is one of the wonderful parts of Venus and Adonis. And Joyce's theory, which like you were saying, is whatever it is kind of points to this question of Anne Hathaway. I was also wondering about the power differential in Nora and Joyce in that terms. I don't know. It's like Joyce is a man, and it's like he was a great writer. He had so much cultural capital with Nora. I don't know. So, and I was also thinking about you and your sister, by the way, Roy. I'm sorry to bring that up, but when you're talking about sisters, but anyway, in terms of gender,
my sisters.
Well, yeah, because you have a whole thing about.
Oh, you mean
about sisters?
I was like, the proximity of sisters, and not my particular sisters.
I have a brother who is like my Oedipal father, and well, you're the oldest son, I think, and you have oldest sister, right? So I'm just interested in
how because I'm the oldest
between male and female, and so when you have that whole chapter about all those associations, I'm like. Crossing from one, and it's a wonderful thing about Bloom being crossing these borders, and but usually they would be taken as insults, as you were saying with the thing. But Joyce is kind of blowing that away, and that's still with us. Like we have Trump, we have all that stuff with us here still. So anyway, I just wanted to bring in some.
Well, there was an element of anti-Semitism too, because there was this idea that the Jews were female, or the men, men were male, female, as opposed to the
female,
strong
it affects
Aryans.
Jews, it affects blacks and whites. Blacks are also seen often as effeminized.
Yeah.
All right, Phil, that was a good question.
The whole the Irish nation.
I'm sorry that I kind of.
Let's do one question at a time when people ask them. But go ahead,
Roy, rather.
We need to remind everybody to turn off their microphones when they're not speaking.
Yeah, it's better to have it off. There's a little distortion. But yeah, Roy, go ahead and finish up on that one, because there's a lot of issues there, and maybe other people's questions can flesh it out. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's the Irish nation was considered to be feminized in relation to the English, conquest and the many defeats that they'd suffered, and there was even a writer who called himself Fiona MacLeod, who was supposed to be the female version of Finn McCool, in a way to say that the Irish heroic. heroic Irish tradition had been feminized through this series of historical reverses that they had suffered. But Matthew Arnold talked about that. The dreamy, ineffectual Celt. But yeah, I'm not. I mean, but the Teresian myth, which is, I guess, that's the central myth of that chapter, is it's the switching back and forth from one sex to the other, and I think Palia's theory about Shakespeare was that part of his greatness was that he was able to shift back between the male and the female.
Right, that was good. Richard, why don't you put yourself on mute, because we are hearing all your incoming phone calls, or throw your
turned the phone off.
Thank you.
I turned the phone off.
So that was good. And Phil, you might consider the word mafia starts with the letters M-A. That's because women run the world, but they let men think they run the world. I ask this question 4 times a week to I'm not saying it's true, it's a theory. I'm saying I ask this question 4 times a week on my podcast. What's the most significant difference between men and women, physical aside? The answer I get that intrigues me the most is there is none. Physical aside, there is none. But culturally, we could argue that forever. But it is this thing about duality, which is what Roy is tackling, excess and restraint. There's 2 parts of this. But go ahead, Phil. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm saying I think the myth is that there is differences, that we're opposite sexes. We're both intelligent. We have one head, 2 head. We have language. We're humans. But the myth is that men are somehow this, or and this, we've been wiping away layers of it, but it's so deep that But to say that there is no difference, but the culture is telling us that there is, and that's what I'm saying. There's power. Whenever you speak, you're speaking in a context that privileges the male. That's all. Anyway.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right, and usually people say what's the most significant difference is that women are emotional and men are linear and blah blah blah. So this is all things that just come up by me asking people questions as a survey, and I see patterns. It's not that it's true. Go ahead, Richard.
Just quickly, has anybody noticed the difference in crime rates of men versus women, or institutions of war, or other kinds of activities? I mean, I've sometimes said, if you make women the head of all the countries in the world, we'd probably have a lot less problems than we're currently enduring.
And then Richard, great point, because that's what I ask often. What caused matriarchy? So Peter Q, you're up. You had a question. Okay, Peter R, Peter Q's got a question. Go ahead, Peter R.
I just wanted to say Margaret Thatcher puts the lie to that.
Yeah.
The one exception, maybe.
He was very good at starting wars.
One exception, but I wouldn't compare Margaret Thatcher.
Golda Meir would be another one.
Yeah, and Indira Gandhi.
Yep. And then you get Maria Gambudis, who's the anthropologist, who said we weren't hardwired to have violence and war. So there's a lot of points of views. We discuss this often. But let's keep going around round robin questions. Keep your questions succinct for Roy and let him go for it. Peter Q, you're up.
Okay, I'll just throw out there real quick in relation to what we were just saying about the differences between the sexes beyond physical. There's an amazing book about this called The Alphabet versus the Goddess by Leonard Swain. Yeah. I won't go into too much detail. Just look it up. It's an amazing book. It's actually, I think it's the most clear explanation of McLuhan's, all McLuhan's ideas that I've ever read. And it also talks about Finnegan's Wake. It's just a really essential book. For Roy, so I'm only a few chapters into the book, but I'm very interested in a number of the chapters I haven't read yet, including chapter 6, Between Ye and Be. So I want to see if you could talk about that a little bit, because I read the first couple paragraphs of it. I see it's about the boundary between self and other. And I've been thinking about that with Joyce in relation to his interest in synchronicity and coincidences and things like that, because to me that represents like a a kind of mysterious alignment between the self and the other, like this perfect intersection between something that's going on in your mind and something you experience out in the world that can't really be explained. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do speak a little bit. There's the tradition of cento, which means patchwork, which Bakhtin talks about, which is freely borrowing. It was kind of before there was the modern sense of copyright and ownership, that there was a free borrowing of other people's writings without bothering to attribute it. Now that's considered like a crime against copyright. But
CHANTO.
CENTO, and even Burton in The Anatomy of Melancholy, he says what he's doing is a cento. He says it's not me, but they who say this, and that's very close to what Joyce said. He said it's not I who am writing this book, it's you and that woman over there sitting at that table. That he was almost like a clearinghouse for all these different voices that he allowed to speak through him, and then that chapter goes into the appearance of mediums in the wake, and Joyce's attitude towards spiritualism and mediumship, and I think to a large extent it was satiric, but I think to a certain extent it wasn't. That he had the wake is in a sense a seance, where he is
Can I just say that sheds a lot of light, because
allowing the dead to
we're all speaking through learning language and cultural discourses, and what you're doing in the wake, it seems like all these cultural discourses it is like a medium, but I kind of see it in a secular way of these voices coming through Joyce in the culture. But anyway, that's
yeah. I mean, he's secular, and I mean, he talks. He does make reference to Mr. Sludge, the medium. That's by Browning about the medium, who is he's exposed as a fraud, and yet at the same time says, well, there was something to it, even though I cheated, there was something to it, and I think Joyce calls himself a shaman and a sham man, so he was, he kind of assuming these paranormal powers while also acknowledging that there's something fraudulent in it.
Well, Peter Q, that's amazing, because you actually wrote this article about the I Ching being similar to the wake, and Blavatsky and all that. That's definitely a subject. But Peter, I think you asked something. You must have ESP, because this is my next article is about identity. So it has been fun skimming through your book, Roy. I mean, your book is amazing, because you can just do it like wake, open it anywhere and have an epiphany, because it's like such a great source. I mean, you really got to get it out to all the Wakians, because it's like the kind of book you can constantly turn to and just get little tidbits of great stuff. And so, what Peter said was what both Krishnamurti and McLuhan said, is violence is our search for identity. So, we're trying to figure out who we are. Like if you study Alan Watts, he says, everybody's trying to figure out who they are. If you find out who you are, you're fucked. So we're all in flux. We're all constantly changing, but we think we have to have some sort of certainty and go, well, what's the name of the on the bottom of my Zoom box? That's who I am. Right. Okay. So me being in the entertainment capital of the world, I have noticed these things. Seeing is believing. No, believing is seeing now. I've noticed it. Here's the headline from Hollywood Reporter. I know who the fuck I am. Harrison Ford. There's certainty with the male. Okay, here's Raquel Welch saying the same thing in her New York Times obit. It's about being yourself on purpose. And then someone who studies Joseph Campbell and helps finance Naomi Klein's political films, Pam Anderson, she said, no one can take me away from me. So this is a question I have for you. And I'm still open for everybody else to raise their hand if they have a question for Roy. But if Roy, you could talk about this thing of identity a little more and the certainty that's involved in identity. You know, did Joyce know who he was, and was he trying to get that out? Like T.S. Eliot said, poetry is outing your inner dialogue. Was Joyce trying to get himself out through Ulysses in the Wake, or was he step aside? We're reading in our Venice Ulysses group the last chapter of Ulysses, and I mean, I'm like amazed at how he can tap into what seems to be the female voice so well. So Roy, maybe you could touch on that and the certainty that we're pressured into knowing ourselves. Is that something that your book tackles or you've come across in your Joyce studies?
Yeah, I mean, as far as Joyce's identity, I mean, I'm sure, you know, he knew who the fuck he was, and he from a very, you know, he had a sense of his greatness as a writer from a very, you know, very young age. But you know, he did. You know, that this is I do mention Love's Body, which is a book I like a lot. That where he talks about, you know, the boundaries between people and the boundaries between properties. He associates that with the fall. You know, that there was this, you know, paradisal sense of unity in human consciousness that was fragmented into individuals. But Brown also mentions the relationship between Lucia and Joyce. You know, that in some way, you know, the boundaries between them were annulled. You know, and in a sense, they became the same person. Or, you know, Jung had the idea of the anima and the animus, that they kind of interchanged. That crisscrossing consciousness, but yeah. I mean, you know, I mean, there's that Glasheen says, you know, how can you speak of the people in Finnegan's Wake when everybody's somebody else? You know, so I think that people are continually shifting their identities. Shem is turning into Sean. Sean is turning into Shem. You know, even the ALP and E, you know, they become the river and mountain system, almost like one identity.
Well, Duncan, you're up next, but Roy, just to follow up really quick, it's like, is this certainty of humans more innate or more invented? Do we want to have certainty? Like, it's epitomized in the line from Finnegan's Wake, which I'll misquote, I know, is love thy name as thyself. Like, we've got to love, you know, you got to love yourself, but first you got to love your name, who you've named yourself. You know, why do we have to even name ourselves? If
he said, love thy label as thyself.
Yeah, that's it. Love thy label as thyself. So that's like, there's something about us we feel we have to name ourselves, you know.
Yeah. Well, he also says, you know, who gave you that numb? You know, there's something a numbing experience about having a name or being pigeonholed into an identity through names.
Well, that's where McLuhan got numbness. Is McLuhan reinterpreted the narcissism as narcosis, which is etymologically rooted in the word numbing. So that's what, you know, as soon as you label yourself, you're numbing yourself because you're restricting yourself Anyways, Duncan, do you have a question for Roy and anyone else after Duncan?
But I think I think that there's something innate.
Oh, hold on. Go ahead, Roy.
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Marcel. Yeah, Duncan, go ahead.
Oh, okay. A couple of maybe very mundane questions, Roy. So,
great.
When did you first get the idea to start this particular book?
Yeah, that's a good question because I'm really not. I can't exactly answer that. You know, I know I did start writing it on. You know, it was more amorphous when I began, and something about once I focused on boundaries, I started noticing how many words had the idea of boundaries in them, and also how many different disciplines. You know, it's a way of entering those different disciplines through the concept of boundaries. And I always had this idea that I'd like to see the wake be a more interdisciplinary. So it's not just, you know, it's not just experts or people who are obsessed with those groups, but that, you know, I think he had something to say about, you know, this kind of, almost like this universal vision that connected to all sorts of different things. And for me, boundaries was a it kind of clicked at one point, you know, where that the more I looked for them, the more I could find.
Right. Right. So once you got the general idea, how long did it take you when you first put your pen to paper to actually completing the book?
I mean, it seems like it was an infinite amount of time. I forget, but yeah, I think it was like well, something about COVID. I had a lot extra time on my hands with the whole COVID thing, and I did made
You
a
had
lot
a
of
boundary to
progress.
work within.
Losing my social life, you know, that was.
Yeah, it can be very useful.
I think it's maybe, you know, that. Yeah, 4 or 5 years, maybe 2. Yeah.
Okay. And I got one more question.
It was originally bigger than it was cut down.
You mean the original project was going to be bigger than what you finally decided would be a good boundary for it?
Well, I originally sent the manuscript to Sebastian Noja. This we do not publish things this big. You know, you have to cut it like in half.
Oh,
so.
Oh, the publisher told you. That's too big, Roy.
Yeah. It's too big.
Okay.
Get rid of all this junk, you know.
So do you have
hold on,
book
Phil. Yeah, Phil and then Richard. But do you have another book? But in that regard, who edited it, Roy? You or they did? Who edited it down?
Well, I had readers, and they, you know, they would give me, you know, 2 anonymous readers. They would give me suggestions, but taking stuff out was, you know, it's basically me. But I found like that was actually a good thing because it really helped me give more shape to the book than it originally.
Good.
It's good. Okay, Phil and then Richard. Go ahead, Phil.
Well, I don't want to talk about expansiveness, but let me say about that. Taking stuff out is a big part of writing. It's true. But I just want to say, Chip he and I have a friendship, as you might know. And we do like rock and roll associations and different things. And he has an expansive imagination that I just totally love. And I wonder about if you see the resonance with Joyce's sort of expansiveness in terms of personality characteristics.
That's your question for Chip?
Yeah, do you see
yeah, well, I mean, I think, yeah.
Like Joyce, I see yourself as sort of having
he's made it, Yeah, he's made it easier for me to free associate, I think.
It frees you.
Harder to concentrate on things in a linear way. But I feel like it's like I obsessively think about puns, and I think it's because it's like every
I do that
like
just I do that for fun.
I hear
You do
puns.
I do it for fun. You do it as your profession, I guess.
I do it for hard work. Yeah, so that's why I do it. No fun.
No fun. Okay, Richard, good question, Phil. Go ahead, Richard.
All right. My question for Chip is when I heard that you were doing a book about boundaries, I wondered whether you ever considered the idea of Finnegan's Wake actually jumping the bounds of literature and playing a role in life and reality. And the pieces that I was sort of, connecting to this were that, the famous story about when Joyce was writing Finnegan's Wake and somebody knocked at the door and Joyce said, come in, and Beckett wrote it down, and that got incorporated into the book. Then after the book was published, what's his name? Gelman saw the word quark in Finnegan's Wake, and so it all of a sudden became the name of an element. And, even for myself, as weird as this will sound to you all, I thought of Finnegan's Wake when I heard about the Chinese surveillance balloon that passed over the United States. And it reminded me of a performance that I saw of an adaptation of Finnegan's Wake that John Cage, who Jerry mentioned, did at the Joyce Theater, I think about 30 years ago. And it involved balloons and dancing. And the characters would exchange tiny balloons with their mouths and then juggle baseball-sized balloons. And finally, huge balloons drifted out over the audience. So I'm just curious about the idea of Finnegan's Wake jumping beyond the bounds of a book and becoming part of culture. Did you ever consider that?
Yeah, I mean, I do have I have a kind of a superstitious feeling about that. Sometimes, headlines in the newspaper are
echo.
Yes, different synchronicities. There's that story, when Joyce was to, I forget who, some woman said that it's outside of literature, meaning it's outside the boundaries of literature. But Joyce didn't like that. He said, its future is inside literature. So I was like, this is going to maybe I'll define the boundaries of literature. Yeah, I mean, I think it connects to so many different things that I think it does maintain a certain kind of contemporaneousness, things that keep repeating over and over again.
Yeah, everywhere I look, I see Finnegan's Wake.
Yeah. It's basically the history of everything that ever happened or ever will happen. But if you tell people that, they go, that's bullshit, until you experience a couple years in a Finnegan's Wake reading club and you go, holy shit, fucking 9/11's on the first page all over it. And it's like, well, you can read anything into anything. Well, go ahead. But when it gets that coincidental, I have lists of them, like Peter was saying at the Venice Wake, we do that much more. There's some of our regular Wakes people, like Bruce Woodside, who directed films for Disney for 20 years. He won't go there at all, but he doesn't diss us from saying, oh, there's Trump. Oh, there's, the day Princess Di died, we were reading the Wake and there were 5 direct references to a bridge, drunk, and it was like evident. It was there, but no one would believe you unless you're in that sense of what reading the Wake is. Go ahead, Duncan.
Well, perhaps, Jerry, you should start up the Fortean version of the Finnegan's Wake reading.
It already happens. I mean, it just happens naturally. You don't even have to
collect it and put it out as a quarterly.
that's too much work, man. Just getting a Zoom together and getting people to raise their hands enough. Okay, Decio, you're up. and then we got Kevin. So Decio, you have one. You got to unmute. There you go.
First of all, Roy, congratulations for his wonderful book that no doubt will clarify the mysteries about Finnegan's Wake for everybody. I have two questions. Mm-hmm. First of all, you concentrate your study in the lesson chapter. Why?
The which chapter?
Lessons.
The lessons chapter.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the word.
The lessons.
Lessons chapter. Yeah. Well, actually, that was. Something about the lessons chapter. The fact that the Shem and Sean cross over in the middle of the lessons chapter, and the crossing of boundaries as much as the establishment of boundaries, and the fact that the lessons chapters is number 10, but it's also it's also the multiplication sign. It seems like the crossroad, the multiplication at the crossroad is almost like an icon for the pun, that kind of breaks down the boundaries.
So it's been a while.
Sense.
You're talking about chapter 10 of Ulysses? Chip?
No. It's chapter 10 of Finnegan's Wake, which has the narrow text running through, which is the river. It's supposed to be the river, and then on either side, you have Shem and Sean making comments.
Issy in the bottom.
And then you have Issy is the footnote.
The bottom.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm familiar with Finnegan.
So it's kind of a parody of it's a parody of the whole scholarly mechanisms, of commentary, where the footnotes make the text more obscure instead of clearing things up, so which Joyce likes to do. But there are all sorts of things about the Kabbalah, and the unlimited taking on boundaries in the Kabbalah, the Ein Sof and the Sephiroth, as kind of a pattern for the marriage of HCE and ALP. But that's definitely a central chapter.
Another question about the art. You talked about Barocco, Impressionism, Chiaroscuro, and then the sfumato from Leonardo. I didn't understand very well the sfumato in the Finnegan's Wake, because Finnegan's Wake is a polysemic, polyphonic, is a linguistic experiment, but I can't see the sfumato in Finnegan's Wake. Could you explain a little bit?
Well, I mean, sfumato. I mean, I think Leonardo said, he said, sfumato it's like a Cheech and Chong. It's the disappearance of the smoke into the air. But there are points where in Wake where it talks about it being written in smoke and all ends vanishing. But there is that conflict in Joyce. It's not just about going beyond bounds. It's also establishing boundaries, and his theory in a portrait. He says the first stage is drawing a bounding line around the object that's going to be represented. But then so many of the things that you just mentioned, like Impressionism and the Baroque and sfumato, had to do with blurring the boundary line.
Blurring, yeah.
And I think that was an argument Michelangelo and Leonardo, that Michelangelo believed in a very clearly defined line. And he even calls them Michelangelines in things like,
It's a kind of
as opposed, yeah. But oddly enough, Blake.
Wait, let Roy finish the point, because
What's
you were
that?
saying Michelangelo is defined and Leonardo was what?
What
Well, his idea of sfumato is the you know, things blending into each other,
Yeah.
and you can't find the bounding line that
boundless. Yeah. Maybe.
Yeah, you see in the Da Vinci's, like behind Mona Lisa in the landscape, you see that fumato, that blurring. Well, Michelangelo is like the classical, you know, he's looking at the classical Greek sculptures, which were painted, but he has the, you know, he develops that modern kind of sensibility. He's like Picasso. It's like the slaves coming out of the rock. It's really the beginning of the modern, and I think the early modern is. But anyway, Michelangelo.
Yeah, it's Decio is great questions, because that was back to the certainty thing. Like if Michelangelo is more defined and certain, and Leonardo is more blurry and undefined and forever changing or flux. So we got Kevin's got one, and then Peter Q. Go ahead, Kevin.
You said that what Decio said, because Michelangelo was a Platonist. I don't know what Da Vinci was, but I don't think he was a Platonist. But anyway, go on. I'm sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. Go ahead.
Okay, yeah, sorry to say hi, Roy. Sorry I can't stay. I have my own presentation coming up soon. I've got to get ready for. But I wanted to just ask you one question before I went. Did you explore Joyce's crossing the boundaries between myth and history? Like, this happens a lot within the wake, not just in relation to
between what history?
Irish, between myth, legend, and history.
Oh, myth and legend.
Yeah. He brings in various. Finn McCool is in there, various mythical characters, but also various historical characters, and they oftentimes get mixed up a lot and put into place. And I don't think it relates either just to kind of Irish history and legend. I'd say part of the fascination of being in the Wake Watchers group is listening to people from different cultures and different experiences talking about it. And this seems to me to be something that Joyce does, not just in terms of blurring those boundaries, but actually crossing over them sometimes and mixing them up a bit. And I don't know, I haven't had the chance to actually read you deeply yet, Roy, but I was wondering if that's something you touched on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that, I mean, I'm not sure exactly what the boundaries. Well, certainly, I mean, you know, when you list the analogs between the Odyssey and the one particular day in Dublin, where you know you have the myth of the son in search of the father, the myth of the father's house being eaten up by the suitors. You know, the goods are being consumed, and when that's translated through Ulysses, it becomes the English, and you know, Stephen is Telemachus. He mythically, you know, he's looking to free his native land, but historically, certainly, he's not equipped to do that. And in fact, you know, he resisted some of his historical resistances. But I mean, the wake, I think, Finnegan's Wake itself, the song is like is a resurrection myth, and you know, it's a resurrection myth, and it's also a vaudeville song, you know, that and brings those changes, you know, all sorts of historical variations in the world. Yeah. But that's I'm sure that crossing over that boundary. So, yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, unfortunately, I got to run now, Roy. But I look forward to kind of discussing that with you, maybe over a glass of wine. or two.
Yeah. Yes, that I would love to do that. I would
The
love
best
to do
way,
that.
really,
Yeah.
to discuss Finland way.
You're in New York or you're in Dublin?
No, I'm in New York at present.
But how long have you been in? You spent most of your life in Dublin?
I don't know how many years it is since I left Dublin. I've been a lot of places since that.
Yeah,
I've been in New York for about I guess about 3 or 4 years now.
Because I'm only single. I'm not Dublin.
Good question, though,
Yeah.
Kevin. That was super because there's a lot going on there. Myth, check out McLuhan's book called From Cliche to Archetype. So it is how we take these things that are myth and legend, and it's constantly flipping back and forth, And it's like whoever wins writes the history books. Just watch McNamara and Fog of War, And you can't tell who wins or loses. That's the thing.
I guess we all lose in
we
war.
we can tell who a hero is, but we can't tell who wins or loses.
Okay. Listen, take care.
Thank you, Kevin.
Go get ready.
Okay, Peter Q, what'd you have up?
Okay, so I'm a few chapters into Joy's book, and I've been learning so much from it. Even though I've been reading The Wake for many years, and we've been doing this reading group for many years, and so when I read a book like this that is so appealing to a Joyce and a Finnegan's Wake nerd like myself, I wonder how do you feel about this book as it relates to a contribution to literary criticism in general, Joyce criticism in general? I'm just wondering, what would you say is this contributes to the reader who's not, obsessed with this material already?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main contribution is being able to come at many different things from that single perspective of boundaries and connecting. It connects nicely up to mathematics or philosophy or cosmology or cosmography. I mean, all those, and I feel like there's in all of those things, there's further work that can be done on that, because I'm not an expert in any of those fields, but I feel like by following. I mean, I think of the Wake as a kind of endless series of wormholes that you can go down if you find the right angle, and I learn a lot, pursuing things no interest in, but just trying to figure out what he might have meant. I've had that experience many times of it opening up these fields of thought. So.
Could I ask about the wormholes? Do they have a historical placement?
Yeah.
Or are they universal time? They universal timeless, or are they historically in place, or somewhat both, or in between? For you, Roy.
Well, for me, I mean, it's linguistic. Just trying to figure out what these composite words are made out of, and what these references. How he is referring to things, but also, not just referring, but expressing things at the same time. But yeah, I know you're a mathematician, Phil. I don't know if I did poorly in geometry, but I did write a chapter on geometry. So.
I was aspiring to be a logician at one point, but I've thrown logic and what is that lyric from Logic? Have fallen dirty dead or something. What is that lyric from Jefferson Airplane Chip? Logic and what have fallen something dead.
From Rejoice.
Yeah, I'm saying,
I know they taught me to be logical.
but I think Joyce has kind of in some ways at least, he's overcome the boundaries of literature, and he's gotten into popular culture, and Finnegan's Wake included.
Right.
I'm very much into Dubliners and Ulysses, but I think, I don't know. Does Pynchon really gonna?
Well, he said at one point, he said, I can't. I can't write in English because that including a tradition felt like he was closed in. So he had to kind of create his own language so that he could go beyond the boundaries of English and language. Richard, yeah.
I actually, Jerry sort of inspired this in me, and I realized that probably the person who has done most with Finnegan's Wake really would be John Cage, who has written a number of books, writings through Finnegan's Wake, and has done numerous performances related. And I just wondered whether you ever considered Cage's somewhat invasion of the boundaries of Finnegan's Wake, so much so that he rewrote Finnegan's Wake in the form of these mesostics, in which he took every page of Finnegan's Wake and grouped them in such a way that James Joyce's name is spelled out on every page. Had you ever considered that as another boundary that was invaded or crossed? Cage does not appear in your book at all.
I'm sure I could probably make a case for it. Yeah. No, Cage is not. I did see Cage do Finnegan's Wake performance once. It's Cooper Union, I think.
Can I say that Cage once on the story?
Yeah, that's on there.
This thing I think applies to Finnegan's Wake. The story about Cage. He was in New York apartment, and there was a piano concert, and the windows were open to the traffic on downtown where Chip lives, actually coming into the window. And his friend said, "John, I'm going to close the window." He goes, No, that's part of it. But that porousness to outside of the text, the Hort text is very up.
Well, he talked about, he differentiated himself from Proust. I remember one point he said Proust writes in these cork-lined rooms where the noise doesn't come in. For me, noises are always intruding on me, and I'm sure he probably would have appreciated John Cage's engagement with him.
Another Cage story. A friend of mine is a mycologist, she's passed away, and John Cage was also a mushroom hunter, and they went up to Vermont on a forage, and they stayed at one of these old inns, and all night long my friend was kept awake because the radiators in the old inn, like this clanging noise when the water passes through. And in the morning she came down to breakfast, and she turned to Cage and said, "Did you hear that racket all night?" And Cage just said, "Wasn't it beautiful?"
Yeah.
I add one Cage story to that. I think that I was told when I was in college that he was taken to the AT&T silent room, but it wasn't, totally silent. And so he went in and he spent some time, and he came out and he said, "But why did I hear these two noises, this low crunching sound and this high pitched?" He goes, "The low crunching sound was the blood going through your vein, and the high pitched one was the sound of your brain waves." I don't know if that's, it's a nice story, or not. It's like Cagey and Joycean story. Sorry,
Jerry, I think you're muted.
I think you might be on mute there, Jerry.
Okay, how's that? Am I on?
Better.
Not mute?
Yeah.
Hey, sorry. That's Cage went in the chamber so he could write the piece of music called 433. And then he heard two things in that chamber. But there's a whole history that song. We could go on forever. But I do like how Roy brought up on page 224 of his book. Joyce insisted that the structure of Finnegan's Wake was mathematical. That's a quote from Ellman. And that's what Thelonious Monk said, that music is math. Monk said that the loudest sound in the universe is silence. And so this is a type of jazz that we're experiencing, but it's all written down. You know, Joyce is some of you might not know the origin of the word jazz. It has various etymological guesses where the word came from. But my favorite is from this sort of weird singer some of you might know, Biff Rose. He said the word jazz came out of just your ass. Jazz, it comes out of your ass. So I mean, that's the epitome of the wake, and that Joyce was pissed that Ulysses got great reviews, so he sat on the toilet and farted out Finnegan's Wake for 17 years. And you know, I was curious if we could have any other questions from anybody else, you know, that they want to ask, or Roy, tell us. Yeah, Duncan and then Decio, and then Roy, you can tell us what questions remain unresolved for you in writing this book, you know, that still intrigue you. But go ahead, Duncan, and then Decio.
It's probably a complex answer, so you don't have to get complex about it. But you spent a lot of time writing this book, and you started probably with some sort of set idea of what boundary was about when you started. What's the major way, if any, that your concept of boundary changed?
Well, that's a, you know, I mean, I did find myself, you know, thinking as much about, you know, violating boundaries as establishing boundaries, and the well, that's why I found Fritz Zenn's terminology useful. He talks about provection and revection. Provection is this urge to go beyond, to get boundaries. But the flip side is revection. We say, you know, you can't continually, you know, break down your boundaries. Eventually, you know, you have it's like systole. You shrink back into this kind of boundal center again, and then you know, begin again, which, as the Wake says. So I mean, I guess, yeah, seeing it as a dialectic of boundary making and violating boundaries, breaking boundaries, and then reestablishing boundaries. I mean, he talks about, you know, the coming of order and orders passing. Yeah, I guess that's.
Hold on.
Yeah, but I was.
Go ahead, Roy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I was pleasantly surprised to see that there just seemed to be something paradigmatic about boundaries that I think you could almost look at anything from the perspective of boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
And language, you know, etymologically, language is.
We got Decio, and then Phil, and then we got Phil up. Decio, go ahead.
Roy, in the chapter related to by the light of philosophy, no? You mentioned Wittgenstein in the Tractatus. Tractatus is really a sharp. We have sharp boundaries, and philosophical investigations, no boundaries. It's very clear there. But when you talk about Giordano Bruno, and the coincidence of the contraries, Bruno was born in Nola, the city close to Naples. And then you said, I don't understand, Bruno opposed to Nola, opposite to himself. Could you explain this? Bruno opposed to Nola.
Well, this is, you know, Yeah. Well, I mean, Joyce. Well, Joyce is very interested in the whole idea of split personality. Issy is a split personality, and I think to a certain extent, Lucia was a split personality, and but yeah, I mean, he does divide. He spoke about him as the Nolan. I think Joy at a very young age, he was kind of mystifying his school fellows by referring to Bruno as the Nolan, as if they should know that. But he does divide him up into kind of like two characters, Brown and Nolan, which was also that was the name of a bookseller in Dublin.
Bookstore, yeah.
So, yeah, but the I guess in that chapter I use Bruno as a counterweight to Aristotle's idea of the law of the excluded middle. That a thing is either true or not true, and there's a sharp boundary between the positive and the negative. Whereas Bruno believed in the coincidence of opposites, or the same thing could be true and not true, or high and low at the same time,
and the true is in the middle,
margin
midway.
Yeah. That's what they say in the library. The truth is midway. That Shakespeare is both Othello and Iago, and he's making himself suffer by.
That's back to McLuhan calling it the resonating interval. It's like the gap is where the action is, the in-betweenness. Okay, Phil, you had something. Go ahead.
Yeah.
No, I'm really enjoying the conversation. The in-betweenness is key. Is definitely key. What Decio was saying also, Chif was mentioning I was thinking of becoming mathematical logic in math department, which they don't have. Unlike physics department, it has philosophy of physics. Math department doesn't have philosophy of math. So I got into linguistic stories, but anyway, language speaking. But Descartes said that you wanted clear and distinct ideas. And what Decio said before about Wittgenstein was about wiping the boundary between that. You have fuzzy ideas. Like Wittgenstein says, you could say, go stand in the corner. It's not clear and distinct boundaries. It's a fuzzy boundary. What's what works is not what's clear and distinct, like Descartes said. So I just wanted to say that. But to me, it seems that Joyce becomes more and more unbounded from, at least from what I know, from Portrait and Stephen Hero and Dubliners, and then into Ulysses. And
so some people say he went from realism to impressionism to expressionism. Dubliners is and to a certain extent Ulysses is very has very sharp. They said you could. Joyce said maybe you could reconstruct Dublin from the book. It's so precise. Whereas in the dream state of the night world of Finnegan's Wake, then all of those boundaries become less distinct. They merge into each other. The identities, but Wittgenstein used the words distinct. I think cloudy and distinct, or that he wanted to make.
But he was famously he says, like, meaning, you have the central of the city, then you have the suburbs of meaning, and it's not like this boundary around a clear, distinct meaning or set. It's like a closer metropolis, and then these suburbs of meaning, and it's used by, for instance, Eve Sedgwick talks about queerness and its central meaning of home, with the home, and the central meaning has to be including homoerotics, but the anti-normative goes outward, generally, and that kind of inclusiveness I think is important. So I'm with kind of anti-boundary, but I kind of feel like I'm falling through cyberspace here, Chip. I'm not able to handle like you are. Anyway.
Well, it goes full circle. Hold on a second, Richard. It goes full circle to the beginning when we said, what Ken Wilber says about walls. And then the three themes are a museum without walls, a center without margins, and the city is classroom. Go ahead, Richard.
Yeah, I've mentioned this to Chip previously, but in mentioning mathematics and physics, it struck me that I believe it was Einstein himself who said, in part about his theory of relativity, that the universe is finite but boundless. And that sort of anomaly is hard for us to understand and comprehend. But one example of that he used apparently was the idea of a sphere, which is finite but has no boundaries per se. Yeah. So I just had wondered whether or not Chip had considered the idea of the boundless universe as part of his thinking about bounds.
Well, at one point he does talk about the expanding universe, and in a way, the expanding universe is one without boundaries. But that's something that Echo talks about. Joyce's development. He went from this kind of bounded Aristotelian world to the world of modern science, which is I suppose the world of relativity, where the difference between the medieval model of the world was that it's bounded by the seven spheres and the primum mobilum, and there was great resistance to the idea that there was, when science started to break down those boundaries, and Bruno was he was a proponent of that idea of breaking down those boundaries, and probably paid for it with his life.
They burned that sucker. Okay, Phil.
They did. Terribly burned.
First of all, some people, like my brothers are physicists, would say Einstein is classical. It's quantum mechanics that burns down the boundaries of fucking reality. It's like it's here. It's like it's the paradox of So Einstein doesn't have paradoxes. It seems paradoxical, but it has a basic mathematical logic to it, even though it's hard to conceive. But yeah, the idea of curved space is really like basic to cosmology. What you're saying, boundless, but yet not infinite. Some people talk about universes on top of one another, perhaps. But anyway, quantum mechanics. But there's a lot of it's become speculative in ways, but it has its mathematical weird logic to it. Anyway, not a fan.
Well, I do quote Stephen Hawking, who says, the boundary conditions of the universe are that it has no boundaries.
Well, again, Roy, I appreciate how many sources you go into, like Camille and Zizek and McLuhan and Umberto Eco. But when you quoted Carolyn Schloss on page 208, I loved it. And she said that Joyce made The Wake a night book because the world in sleep was a world that failed to stay in place. And I was wondering, again, back to that theme we started at the beginning, this idea of place, because, we're all sharing this 2 hours together and we're without our body, as McLuhan would say. We're discarnate. We can see each other and we can hear each other, but we are not really here. It sure feels like it. And I appreciate Phil saying he loves this conversation, because it's always good to get some feedback on these things. But Andre, what's his name? Carl Andre, the sculptor, says sculptor as place. And I think that's what The Wake is. The Wake is a place, the book as place. And it's forever changing. And we want to think that a place that, you know, it's like, go ahead, Roy. Any thoughts on that? Yeah.
No, I mean, the last chapter of the book is called Decomposition of Place. But yeah, I mean, I think Joyce is someone who had an incredibly, you know, precise, obsessive sense of place, of Dublin. You know, he left Dublin. Did I ever leave it? You know, he knew the streets. He knew every single shop and bar and on every street. You know, you could name them. But
it exists in your head. The place that he had from childhood of Dublin was in his head. That was the place in his head that which the you know.
Yeah. He carried it with him as an exile. Yeah, but a lot of the wake, I think, is this idea of placelessness and wandering, you know, as well as place. I mean, from one point of view, everything takes place in Chapelizod, in a pub, and it's the Earwicker family. But from another perspective, it's like all places, all times, and you know, you can't really. There's this almost like an obsession with not being able to rest at a place. That there's no Sabbath for nomads. That's what he says.
Right.
Nomadic. Yeah, Rich.
I was just going to say, with regards to Dublin in particular, it's my sense, and I go back often, that I believe Joyce would be very disappointed at how much Dublin has changed since his time, in terms of wiping out. For example, the House of the Dead is now being converted into a Airbnb place. Yet at the same time, much of Dublin looks like a James Joyce theme park with large paintings of him on the sides of buildings. So I don't know whether or not the, you know, tributes to him would take over from the lack of having the real places, or that he would feel somewhat justified in what's happened. But for those of us who really value the original locations, I'd rather have the original locations than all the tchotchkes that you see throughout the city.
Yeah, but hold on, Duncan. But Richard, if you gotta, you know, if you go to Sweeney's Finnegan's Wake reading every week like we do, and you meet PJ, I think Joyce would have a trip hanging out with PJ because it seems as though it's that it typifies what Blarney is. Blarney is convincing someone to go to hell, and they think they're going to have a good time. Hey, Duncan.
Well, all this talk about place is really interesting to me, because although where I am right now, I've been for 30 years, I have a distinct feeling for the transitness of all places, because the only reason that this is still a place for me after 30 years is because I moved out of the city and they haven't quite caught up to me yet. But, you know, I lived in Tokyo, that whole area was destroyed. I lived in the Caribbean and a colony, that all was destroyed. I lived around the university in Austin, that has all been radically changed. And so I go through the world with a feeling of transitousness. And I think that that was actually an important part of Joyce. I mean, how many places did he move to? He always was moving. And he was in a world, you know, we were talking about the masculine feminine thing. I mean, the thing about the masculine point of view and logic and mathematics and all that, World War I completely demolished that conceit. And then almost immediately was the Great Depression. And then there was World War II, which he experienced, you know, was a run up to and part of the beginning. So I think he had a real keen understanding of change, and that all boundaries, he said at one time, someone asked about family, and he said, that's the most important thing. And I think that was where he was taking his stand, was in his family.
Duncan is
Mhm.
suggesting that this book it was written during the up to World War II. It's like the fascist uptake. Could you talk about the relationship of fascism and Joyce's work, or whatever Joyce universe?
Well, remember that there was not only World War I, but there was also the lead up to the Irish Revolution.
And the lead up to Hitler and Franco and Hitler.
Yeah, but yeah, that's true. There was all of that also, but also in terms of Dublin, remember that there was the rebellion against the English, and then there was the Civil War within Ireland itself. It was a pretty horrendous event, and I would say one of the reasons why Joyce tended to have great sympathy for the feminine, if you will, and either recognized or was hoping for a porousness between the masculine and the feminine, is because it was basically the male and the conceit that logic and science was going to make everything rational. It completely broke down. The World War I was a total shock, and Joyce, I think, recognized that. So, and he's trying to get back, this is my opinion, he's trying to get back to having a boundary that is not rigid, but is more humane boundaries and more fluid than the boundary world in Victorian English and Catholic Dublin and ideological, the ideologies of social.
He had experience. He had experience when he was very young. When his father's finances fell apart. I think Stanislaus said they lived in 11 places in 9 years, and that was a big shock because he grew up well-to-do, with this very stable sense. And then when the bottom fell out, they kind of became nomadic. But I think there was something he liked about that.
Shakespeare has the same exact experience. His father was alderman of Stratford, and then the bottom fell out, and it looks like it's like a system of propelling these people to greatness. It seems.
Right. Well, look at Dante.
Yeah.
Right.
Driven out, banished.
Yeah, Dante.
Banished from his home.
The exile.
And then it was after his banishment that he did the greatest work by far. So,
speaking of location,
actually, Joyce said something.
Location.
Joyce said something about Dante, which reminded me of what Charlie Parker said about heroin, where I think he was shooting up. He said that this is my home, Joyce said something very about reading Dante. That I don't have a specific place, but I live in the Divine Comedy. That's a place for me.
Which is hell, right? There's two things. There's like, first of all, Dante is very set in Florence in a particular place, and it's in hell at the same time. It's like, Beckett and non-Beckett, it's like both. But
there's a great question that the movie Problema asks. It goes, should you have a right to choose where you live? And I've asked this to people often. They go, yes, of course. And I'm like, no, we should live where we were raised and be true to our homeland in a way. I know it's a free choice world, but it's like there's a funny saying that goes, bloom where you're planted. That's where you're planted. And, each one of us can rationale why we moved from where we were raised. But indeed, this is what anthropologists say. You only need 150 people in your area. You don't have to worry about earthquakes on the other side of the world. Care about the 150 people in your area.
That's your
So-
universe to people, but what's the ancient pre-Socratic Greek guy who's like, I'm a citizen of the world. I don't feel like I don't feel like my country, my land, 'tis of thee, like American. I feel like I'm
Yeah, well, that's the cliche too when discussing homeless is the earth is everyone's home. No one's homeless. We're houseless. People don't have houses. So, I think it's funny, Roy, that you named your book Beating the Bounds. And, I looked it up and it has its own Wikipedia entry. And it says ancient customs still observed in parts of England, Wales, and the New England region of US, which traditionally involved swatting local landmarks with branches to maintain a shared mental map of parish boundaries. Now that is a heavy wording. Maintain a shared mental map. I mean, is that what Joyce is doing? He's somehow tapping into this universal memory theater. That's what Philip K. Dick called the wake. Yeah, go ahead, Roy.
Well,
Yes, sir.
Jesse, I was going to say something. Yeah.
Could you explain this image in the cover?
Yeah. Well, that's an image of them going out to beat the bounds with the sticks, the children, and they seem to be beating the guy also, but yeah, they're about to set out on the procession around the parish boundaries, I guess.
But Roy, you knew that this is still something that's practiced in New England?
I never heard that it was in New England. I didn't, but I did. I know that there was a story because they recently it was some country in Europe where they recently passed a law that they could no longer throw the children against the boundaries. They couldn't bash them against the boundary stones anymore. Children were getting injured.
There's a book called
Beating the Boundaries.
There's actually a book called The Stone Walls of New England, and it talks about how
that's about beating the bounds.
It is about beating the bounds, but one of the insights I took from the book was that when those stone walls were constructed, people thought that they were setting up boundaries for property lines. But in fact, the reason why the stone walls were built were to keep the livestock from fleeing, essentially.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, that's what New England.
But I like the fact there's that connection between he talks about Aristotle finding out the boundaries of bodies by knocking his sconce against it, which is very similar to Samuel Johnson kicking the stone to refute Berkeley's idea that there are no material boundaries in the universe.
Well, the material is interesting. Socrates died rather than leave Athens. So location, I guess.
Well, we got to close out here in a few minutes, gentlemen. It's really been an honor and a pleasure. And, I think it's what resonates with me in studying Frank Zappa, who declared James Joyce as an influence on his first album, is that all times are happening now. And Roy, just in closing, you might talk about something I learned from Zappa and Joyce is how to embrace contradiction. And so that's what you got two ends of the spectrum, excess and restraint. And I'm especially fond of the fact that you went into the word chaosmos, or how do you pronounce that? Mixing chaos and cosmos.
I say chaosmos. Yeah.
Chaos.
That's just
But tell us what that other word means. Where it's spelled CHIAS. What's that word? That Joyce is evoked.
Well, actually, I wrote. Well, Wallace Stevens wrote a poem called "Connoisseur of Chaos," where he talks about going between a great disorder and a violent order, and how they kind of change into each other. but
Mm.
but chiasmus is a trope, ABBA, you know, like ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. It's kind of a reversal, but
It's a rhetorical device.
What's that?
A part of rhetoric, in a sense.
It's a rhetorical.
It's one of the rhetorical tropes.
Rhetorical crossing, yeah.
Yeah. It is the crossing, but that, yeah, I speak a lot about that in the book. But you know, the spirit is the body is the spirit.
But you
So
also
it is a way of kind of connecting opposites.
what I wasn't familiar with was Derrida's
Up is
Cora.
down and down is up.
I thought you were asking about
Yeah.
KRA.
KHR, yeah. It's actually, yeah, Plato's Cora, but Derrida.
What is that? I'm surprised. Well, Derrida's an anti-Platoist, so I'm surprised. Tell us about that.
I wouldn't say that. I don't know. But yeah. I mean, the Cora is, you know, the things oscillating between, you know, one thing being neither this or that, or being both this and that. So it is another way of crossing boundaries and connecting.
You know, this reminds me very, very much of the yin and yang symbol.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm.
And of the classic image of the yang side of the mountain is the sunny side of the mountain, and the yin side of the mountain is the shady side of the mountain. And of course, there's that whole thing with different combinations of light and shade, and that is essential for a dynamism of living.
I wonder if
I really love a little bit of the dark and the light and the light and the dark. You know, those little circles.
I wonder if that's from the male perspective. If the yin won't say, or whatever, the female won't say that the other one is dark and they are light. You know, so I don't. It's like Montaigne said, do I speak to my cat, or do I play with my cat, or does my cat play with me? You know,
play with my cat or my cat.
Both ends.
That's the wake, Phil.
That's the chiasmus. That's the chiasmus right there. Yeah.
That's it. Do we play with the wake, or does the wake play with us? See, the wake is a living organism. And your book is too, Roy. So we got to close out here. I'm sorry, I got to go, gentlemen.
Okay.
I appreciate
this is really fun. I really appreciate everybody's coming and
Roy, this has been really fun. And all this chaos and cosmos, even though I'm going to hit the end broadcast button, I still hope this conversation can go on and on forever and ever. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Roy. Thanks, Jerry.
Thank you, Roy.
Thanks, everybody.
Take care.
Thanks, Jerry. Yeah.
Have a good one.